In the blazing heat of a July morning in 1187, two armies stood poised on the rocky hills of Palestine, their banners snapping in the desert wind. On one side, the cream of Christian knighthood, armored in steel and driven by faith, marched under the sacred symbol of the true cross. On the other, the disciplined ranks of Saladin's forces, united under the crescent moon and burning with righteous purpose. What unfolded over the next hours would not merely decide the fate of a single battle. It would shatter the dream of a Christian kingdom in the East and echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. The summer of 1187 had begun with whispers of war drifting across the dusty roads of the Holy Land. In the shadow of ancient Jerusalem, where pilgrims once walked in peace, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, that glittering prize of the First Crusade, stood fractured and vulnerable, torn apart by the very ambitions that had once made it strong. Yet few could have imagined that within months, the cross would be torn from the holy city's walls, and the lion's roar of Christendom would fall silent before the advance of a Kurdish warrior whose name would become legend. This is the story of how a single act of betrayal ignited a war that consumed kingdoms, how the greatest army the Crusader states had ever assembled marched to its doom across the scorched hills of Galilee, and how one man's vision of unity triumphed over a century of Christian dominance in the land where Christ himself had walked. The road to disaster began not with the clash of armies, but with the poison of politics and the fatal pride of men who mistook their own strength for divine favor. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187 was a realm at war with itself. Where once the banner of Godfrey of Bouillon had united Christian knights in common cause, now rival factions schemed and plotted in the shadow of the Holy Sepulchre. The crown sat uneasily upon the head of Guy of Lusignan, a man whose claim to the throne came not through blood or conquest, but through marriage to Queen Sibylla. His rule was contested, his authority questioned, and his kingdom divided between those who supported him and those who despised everything he represented. On one side stood the court faction, newcomers to the Holy Land who had risen through ambition rather than service. At their head was Raynald of Chatillon, a man whose very name had become synonymous with violence and treachery. The Knights Templar, led by their Grand Master Gerard de Riedefort, threw their considerable weight behind Guy's cause. These were men intoxicated by their own power, drunk on the wealth that flowed through the trade routes of the East, and blind to the storm clouds gathering on their borders. Against them stood the nobles' faction, led by Raymond III of Tripoli, a veteran of decades of warfare in the Holy Land. Raymond had served as regent for the child king Baldwin V, and understood better than most the delicate balance required to maintain Christian rule in a hostile land. He championed the claim of Isabella, Sibylla's half-sister, and her husband Humphrey IV of Toron. These were the old families of Outrema, men whose fathers had carved kingdoms from the desert with sword and sacrifice, and who understood that survival depended on wisdom as much as warfare. The bitter irony was lost on none who witnessed it. The kingdom founded to unite Christendom against the infidel now stood divided against itself, its strength sapped by the very passions that had once driven knights across continents to fight for the cross. In the councils of Jerusalem, Christian argued with Christian, while beyond the walls, a far more dangerous enemy watched and waited. That enemy was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin. Where the Christians squabbled, he had unified. Where they divided their strength, he had concentrated his power. Rising from the chaos of Muslim political fragmentation, Saladin had achieved what his predecessors could only dream of. He was master of Egypt, ruler of Damascus, conqueror of Aleppo. From the Nile to the Euphrates, the crescent banners flew under his command. Saladin was no mere warlord driven by conquest alone. He was a man possessed by vision, convinced that Allah had chosen him to reclaim Jerusalem from the infidels. His court chroniclers spoke of him as the defender of the faithful, the sword of Islam, the instrument of divine will. Yet he was also a pragmatist, a diplomat who understood that lasting victory required more than battlefield triumph. He had spent years building alliances, forging the scattered emirates and kingdoms of the Muslim world into a weapon pointed directly at the heart of the Crusader states. By 1187, Saladin controlled territory that encircled the Christian holdings like the closing fist of a giant. His armies could strike from Egypt in the south, from Damascus in the east, from Aleppo in the north. The Crusader states, once the hammer that had shattered Muslim resistance, now found themselves the anvil upon which that same Muslim world prepared to strike back. The balance of power had shifted, and both sides knew that the final reckoning was at hand. The spark that ignited this powder keg came from the most unlikely of sources. Raynald of Chatillon, master of the fortress of Kerak, had built his reputation on the systematic violation of every treaty, truce, and diplomatic agreement that might have preserved peace. In late 1186 or early 1187, despite a carefully negotiated truce between Saladin and the kingdom again, of Jerusalem, Raynald's struck rich caravan wound its way north from Egypt toward Syria, its camels laden with spices, silk, and gold. The merchants traveled under the protection of the truce, confident in their safety. Raynald saw only opportunity. With a band of his most trusted knights, he descended upon the caravan like a wolf upon sheep. The merchants were seized, their goods confiscated, their families taken prisoner. When word reached Saladin's court, the Sultan's rage was terrible to behold. Here was not merely an act of banditry, but a calculated insult to his authority, a deliberate provocation that could not go unanswered. Saladin's envoys rode to Kerak, demanding compensation for the seized goods and the release of the prisoners. Their reception was a study in contempt. Raynald refused to receive them, declared that he recognized no truce with the Saracens, and proclaimed himself lord of his own land, answerable to no king. When King Guy himself sent messengers ordering Raynald to make restitution, the Lord of Kerak's response was defiant. He was, he declared, lord of his domain just as Guy was lord of his, and he would make no peace with the enemies of Christ. The die was cast. Saladin, his honor insulted and his authority challenged, made a vow that would echo through the halls of both Kerak and Jerusalem. If ever he held Raynald of Chatillon in his power, he would kill him with his own hands. It was a promise born not merely of anger, but of political necessity. The Muslim world was watching. If Saladin allowed such an insult to pass unanswered, his carefully constructed authority would crumble like sand in the desert wind. Through the spring of 1187, both sides prepared for the storm that was coming. Saladin's messengers rode across the breadth of the Muslim world, carrying the call to holy war. From the madrasas of Baghdad to the markets of Cairo, the faithful answered. Warriors flocked to his banners, driven by religious fervor and the promise of rich booty from the conquered lands of the Franks. The greatest army Saladin had ever commanded began to gather on the windswept plains south of Damascus. Through the late spring and early summer months, contingent after contingent arrived to swell his ranks. From Egypt came the disciplined Mamluks, slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of war, their curved swords gleaming like crescents in the desert Sunday. From the steppes beyond the Euphrates rode the Turkmen cavalry, masters of the horse and bow, whose ancestors had swept across Asia with Alp Arslan and the great Seljuks. Syrian regulars marched under the banners of Damascus and Aleppo, while Kurdish mountain warriors descended from their highland fortresses to serve the man they called their kinsman and lord. But this was more than a gathering of professional soldiers. Word of the coming jihad had spread like wildfire through mosque and marketplace, stirring hearts that had long yearned for the liberation of Jerusalem. Volunteers came in their thousands, merchants abandoning their shops, farmers leaving their fields, scholars setting aside their books to take up the sword. They came not for gold or glory, but for the promise of paradise and the chance to pray once more in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where Abraham had walked and Muhammad had ascended to heaven. By late May, the host that assembled on the Golan Heights numbered some 40,000 men, the largest force Saladin had ever led to war. At its heart stood 12,000 cavalry, the steel-tipped spear of Muslim military might. These were not the heavy knights of the West, encased in metal and dependent on the thunderous charge. These were the heirs of centuries of steppe warfare, masters of mobility and archery, capable of striking like lightning and fading like smoke before their enemies could respond. The sight of this vast encampment was like something from the pages of ancient legend. Thousands of black goat hair tents stretched across the plateau, their peaked roofs rippling in the wind like a dark sea. The air thrummed with activity as armorsmiths hammered out mail shirts and arrow points, as grooms tended to the countless horses that would carry Islam to victory, as imams led prayers that rose to heaven like incense. At the center of it all stood Saladin's own pavilion, a magnificent structure of silk and gold that proclaimed to all who saw it that here was the power that would humble the cross. On the last day of June, this mighty host crossed the Jordan River and entered the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The invasion had begun. Village after village emptied before their advance, the Christian inhabitants fleeing westward with whatever possessions they could carry. Smoke rose from burning settlements as Saladin's forces spread across the countryside like a plague of locusts, stripping the land bare of everything that might sustain their enemies. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. For nearly a century, the Crusader states had been the hammer that struck at the heart of Islam. Now the roles were reversed. Now it was Christian bells that fell silent as Muslim armies advanced, Christian fields that burned under the summer sun, Christian families that huddled behind stone walls and prayed for deliverance that might never come. In Jerusalem, the news of Saladin's crossing struck like a thunderbolt. King Guy summoned his council, and the great hall of the Tower of David echoed with heated debate. Should they wait behind their walls, trusting in stone and steel to preserve them? Should they march north to meet the enemy in open battle? The kingdom's greatest military asset had always been its heavy cavalry, the armored knights who could shatter any enemy line with the weight of their charge. But those same knights had never faced an enemy like this, an army that moved like the wind itself and struck from distances where lance and sword could not reply. The debate might have continued for days, but Saladin himself forced their hand. His advance guard, led by his son Al-Afdal and the fierce emir Gokburi, struck at the city of Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The city walls were strong, but the garrison was small, and within hours the Muslim banners flew from the battlements. Only the citadel held out, its walls black with smoke, and its defenders growing fewer with each passing hour. The news reached the Crusader camp at Sepphoris like a dagger to the heart. Tiberias was more than just another city. It was the domain of Raymond III of Tripoli, and within its besieged citadel his wife Ashiva waited for rescue or death. The symbolism was unmistakable. Saladin had struck at the very heart of the noble faction, gambling that Christianvalry would compel them to march to the rescue of a lady in distress. The trap was set, and it was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Raymond himself counseled patience, arguing with the cold logic of a man who had fought Muslims for 30 years. Saladin's army could not maintain itself indefinitely in the field. The summer heat would take its toll on both man and beast. Better to wait, to let the enemy exhaust himself against stone walls, to strike when the moment was right, rather than when emotion demanded action. But emotion was precisely what Saladin had counted upon. Gerard de Ridefort, Grand Master of the Templars, thundered that no true knight could stand idle while a Christian lady faced death at infidel hands. The newer nobles, led by Raynald of Chatillon himself, declared that Raymond's caution was mere cowardice, the counsel of a man grown old and soft in his eastern palace. King Guy, caught between competing factions and desperate to prove his worth as a war leader, found himself pulled inexorably toward the decision that would doom them all. The argument raged through the sweltering heat of July 2nd, as outside the walls of Sepphoris, the largest Christian army ever assembled in the Holy Land prepared for war. Nearly 20,000 men stood ready to march, their banners bright in the afternoon sun, their armor gleaming despite the dust that coated everything under the merciless Palestinian sky. Knights from every corner of the Crusader states had answered the call. Templars and Hospitallers, their white and black surcoats marking them as the elite of Christian military orders. French knights whose grandfathers had followed Godfrey de Bouillon to the walls of Jerusalem. Italian nobles who had crossed the Mediterranean seeking glory and gold in the service of the cross. German warriors whose ancestors had answered the call of Bernard of Clairvaux. English knights funded by the silver of Henry Plantagenet. But numbers alone would not decide this battle. The Christian army was magnificent to behold, but it carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. These men had stripped every castle and city of its garrison to march under Guy's banner. If this army fell, there would be nothing left to defend the Holy Land. It was a single throw of the dice upon which the fate of the entire Crusader enterprise rested. As the sun set on July 2nd, King Guy made his fateful decision. The army would march at dawn. They would cross the waterless hills of Galilee in the heat of summer, trusting in God and steel to see them through to victory. In the Muslim camp beyond the Jordan, Saladin smiled when his spies brought him word of the Christian decision. The Franks had taken the bait. Tomorrow would bring the battle that would decide the fate of Jerusalem itself. The dawn of July 3rd broke blood-red over the hills of Galilee, and with it came the sound that would haunt Christian chroniclers for generations to come. The thunder of 20,000 feet marching in unison, the creak of leather and jingle of mail, the snorting of destriers and the flutter of countless banners in the morning breeze. The greatest army the Crusader states had ever assembled was on the move, and every man among them believed that God himself marched at their side. King Guy rode column, his royal at the head of the standard bright against the azure sky. Behind him came the flower of Christian knighthood, their lances held high like a forest of steel. The sight was magnificent, a river of gleaming armor flowing across the barren landscape. Yet those who looked closely might have noticed the tension in the ranks. These men were marching not towards certain victory, but into the unknown, across terrain that favored their enemies and away from the water sources that meant life itself in this merciless land. The plan seemed simple enough. Strike fast across the hills, relieve Tiberias before Saladin could consolidate his position, then force the Muslim army to battle on ground of Christian choosing. It was the kind of bold stroke that had won the First Crusade, the aggressive tactics that had carved kingdoms from the desert sand. But the men who had conquered Jerusalem 90 years before had faced a divided enemy, Muslim armies that fought as much against each other as against the cross. Now they faced something altogether different. From his position on the high ground overlooking the Christian line of march, Saladin watched the approaching army with the calm satisfaction of a spider observing flies in its web. He had spent months preparing for this moment, positioning his forces with the precision of a chess master moving pieces across the board. His light cavalry had already secured every water source along the Christian route, while his main force controlled the high ground that commanded the approaches to Tiberias. The Franks would march through a gauntlet of his choosing, and every step would bring them deeper into the trap he had so carefully prepared. The first attacks came before the Christian army had covered half the distance to its objective. Muslim horsemen appeared as if from nowhere, dark shapes flowing across the hills like shadows given substance. They struck at the flanks of the column with a rain of arrows, then melted away before the heavy knights could respond. It was warfare of a kind the Crusaders had never experienced, fought by men who treated battle not as a test of courage, but as an exercise in deadly mathematics. The arrows fell like hail upon the marching Christians, finding gaps in armor, striking down horses, creating chaos in ranks that had begun the day in perfect order. Men cursed and died under the remorseless sun, while their enemies remained tantalizingly out of reach, visible one moment, vanished the next. The disciplined advance began to fray at the edges as knights broke formation to chase phantoms across the rocky ground, only to find themselves isolated and overwhelmed by swarms of Muslim cavalry that seemed to materialize from the very stones. But it was not just the arrows that tormented the Christian army. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became a living thing that pressed down upon them like the weight of mountains, the greatest enemy revealed itself to be the land itself. This was summer in Palestine, where the very air shimmered with furnace heat and every breath burned the lungs like fire. The knights, encased in steel that had become ovens under the blazing sun, began to understand the true nature of their ordeal. Water became more precious than gold. The few streams they encountered had been poisoned or fouled by Muslim advance parties, their banks littered with the bloated corpses of animals. Wells had been filled with stones or befouled beyond use. The Christian army, which had begun its march with confidence, now stumbled forward like men walking through a nightmare, their tongues swollen with thirst, their vision blurred by heat and exhaustion. Saladin's tactical genius became fully apparent as the day wore on. He had turned the very geography of Palestine into a weapon, using the summer heat and waterless terrain to accomplish what no amount of steel could achieve. His mounted archers hung on the flanks of the Christian column like wolves, shadowing a wounded elk, striking again and again. never allowing their enemies a moment's rest or respite from the constant rain of death. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical toll. These were men who had grown up on tales of Crusader valor Christian, of knights sweeping all before them in righteous fury. Now they found themselves helpless against an enemy they could not reach, dying not in glorious combat but like animals driven to exhaustion by relentless hunters. The very foundations of their military doctrine crumbled before the reality of Muslim tactical superiority. As the afternoon sun reached its merciless zenith, the Christian advance had slowed to a crawling pace. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, their armor too hot to touch with bare hands. Horses stumbled and fell, their flanks white with foam, their eyes rolling in agony. The proud banners that had fluttered so bravely at dawn now hung limp in the still air, while the columns stretched and twisted like a great serpent in its death throes. King Guy, his royal surcoat dark with sweat, called a halt near the village of Hattin. Before them rose two barren hills that local inhabitants called the Horns, their rocky peaks jutting into the sky like the broken teeth of some ancient giant. Between these hills lay a small plateau, waterless, but offering some protection from the constant harassment of Muslim cavalry. It was here, with night falling and his army on the verge of collapse, that the King of Jerusalem made camp for what would prove to be his last night as a free man. The Christian camp that evening was a study in despair. Men who had ridden out that morning singing hymns of praise now huddled around smokeless fires, their faces gaunt with thirst and exhaustion. The wounded lay in long rows, their groans mixing with the prayers of chaplains who moved among them like angels of mercy in a scene from hell itself. Water was so scarce that a cup of the precious liquid could buy Desta nitria, yet even gold could not conjure moisture from the bone-dry ground. In the royal pavilion, Guy held council with his surviving lords, their faces lit by the flickering flames of oil lamps. The situation was desperate beyond word measure. They surrounded, cut off from all sources of water, their army decimated by heat and harassment. Some counseled retreat, a fighting withdrawal back toward the safety of Sepphoris and its. Others argued for a Wells' desperate dawn assault, trusting in the weight of heavy cavalry to break through Muslim lines and reach the waters of the Sea of Galilee. But even as they debated, the trap was closing around them. In the darkness beyond the Christian perimeter, Saladin's forces moved like ghosts, taking positions that would seal every avenue of escape. Muslim engineers worked through the night, positioning mangonels and other siege engines to command the approaches to the plateau. Thousands of archers found cover among the rocks and scrub, their quivers full and their bowstrings taut with anticipation of the morning's work. As midnight passed and the new day dawned, both armies knew that July 4th would bring the decisive battle. For the Christians, it would be a fight for survival, a desperate attempt to break free from the trap that had closed around them. For Saladin's forces, it would be the culmination of years of planning, the moment when the dream of reconquest would become reality. The first light of dawn revealed the full extent of the Christian predicament. They were surrounded on all sides by Muslim forces that seemed to have materialized from the very rocks. Every ridge, every outcropping, every fold in the ground concealed archers and cavalry ready to pour death upon the trapped Crusaders. The Horns of Hattin had become a killing ground from which there could be no escape. Thus ended the dream of a Christian kingdom in the East, shattered not by the weight of numbers alone, but by the fatal combination of pride and folly. At Hattin, the lion's roar fell silent, and with it died the illusion that faith and steel could triumph over wisdom and unity. The echoes of that defeat still whisper across the centuries, reminding us that even the mightiest empires can fall when their strength is divided against itself.